Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first video of this YouTube channel. Because of the obvious importance that the first video a YouTube channel puts out has, I've decided to start by talking about the franchise that I feel like I'm the most knowledgeable in. I've read over 50 books of, I've listened to over a dozen audiobooks, I've read hundreds of short stories, and I've played the games. I have been engrossed in this franchise for a decade of my life. Half of my life. And that franchise is, obviously, 40K. However, before I start, I would like to make a preface. Not just for this video, and not just for the things that will be said within it, but also for every subsequent video I make after this. In 1987, Rogue Trader, the first Warhammer 40K Codex, was released. Since then, 37 years of books and campaigns and movies and shows and video games have built and compounded and made this incredibly complex world. When you have so many authors working on one story, it's inevitable that there will be plot holes or things that just don't really make sense. Look into the first codex of Rogue Trader. We have half Eldar Space Marines. What the hell is that? Granted, this is a very, very old and very extreme example, but this kind of thing happens fairly frequently. When we look at the Horus Heresy, if we take, for example, Perturabo, the Primarch of the Iron Warriors, he was portrayed at least 4 different times by different authors. Now, all of them, of course, had a story to follow and plot points that they needed to meet so that they continue on the narrative of, the Horus Heresy, but they have pretty much absolute freedom when it comes to personifying and actually writing the characters. I pick out Perturabo for this example because we see such vastly different interpretations of his person that we're kind of left with this weird mush of like, yeah, he's a being of logic, but then he'll also lash out in anger and feel jealous and envious all the time. We have his interpretation in the Siege of Terra, which is a great example of this, where he cuts back and forth between having fits of absolute rage, destroying everything around him, and then he'll simply sit down and stare at data and information that's coming out of the siege, because he doesn't know how to feel these emotions. He doesn't know how to deal with these emotions. But then we also have the Perturabo who was introduced to his legion, where the first thing he did was an act that I believe it's called the Edict of Obliteration, where the entire legion is broken up into groups of 10, and every single person chooses who the weakest is out of their group of 10. Once that's decided, the other 9 viciously beat and kill that 10th person, so that the rest may be strong. So we have a Perturabo who the first thing he does when he's introduced to his legion is wipe out a 10th of it. No, that's wrong. The first thing he did was force a legion to execute a 10th of its own brothers. This is during the Horus Heresy. This occurred during a time when it was thought impossible for Space Marines to kill one another in combat. They thought there was no way that a Space Marine could be betrayed and killed by one of his own viciously. Sure, Space Marines died against each other in duels and combat and stuff like that, but this is different. This was an execution. It was a massacre. And now you're gonna say he's all grumpy and jealous because he had to leave the siege when he wanted to win it for himself? It doesn't mesh for me. It doesn't make sense. So every time you watch a YouTube channel talking about the lore, or it comes up on your For You page of a guy talking about one of the Katachan jungle fighters or something like that. Everything that you hear is true. I'm sure it is. I'm sure they're not lying to you. But there's so many different types, so many different interpretations, and so many different explanations for things that there's always going to be inconsistencies. So one of the reasons why I love Warhammer so much is because it's your job to make the narrative that you want. In my headcanon, there are the 4 main chaos gods, and there's also other smaller gods, but one of them specifically is Malal, or Malice. This is a god that was retconned, I think, after the first edition of Warhammer. But it's so cool and so fascinating to me as a god and as an idea that for me it still exists. And for me it's real, and it's there. And it's the warp. So because I think it's real, it is real. So, every time you watch Major Kill or Arch Warhammer or One Mind Syndicate, always keep in mind that if they say something that doesn't really sit right with you, it doesn't really feel accurate, it doesn't have to be. But, with all of that being said, I think it's time for me to start talking about why we're actually here. You're all not here to hear about me ramble about the Horus Heresy and plot holes. You're here to hear me talk about the warp. It was said that no living being could stand to look into the madness of that other realm for more than an instant, lest their mind be forever petrified by what they saw there. The warp opened up to them in a raw-edged, bleeding orifice, a wound in the surface of space-time. It grew into an abyssal, laughing maw that engulfed them as the Terminus Est was first to cross the boundary into the unreal. The Buried Dagger by James Swallow. The Warp. Some people call it the Sea of Souls, others the Immaterial Ocean. Most just call it Hell. The Warp, it's an impossibly complex and confusing dimension that can't truly be defined. The best way to visualize the warp in your head is to imagine a roiling ocean. An ocean as large as the Milky Way galaxy, in which its tidal waves are as large as solar systems. An incalculably large ocean of pure, inhospitable energy. An ocean is a good analogy, as the warp isn't a static, set world that you can make a map for. One day, it might be one massive world that everything in the warp lives upon. One gigantic world. Another, it could be 10 trillion planets, floating around in this primordial soup of ooze and liquid. It's always changing. It's not just physics, though, because the warp sees time as an informal construct as well. They see time as a rule that only some people have to follow, because in the warp, the gods are omnipotent. They always have been and always will be. But they've also been birthed, and they also conceivably can die. If you're confused now, congratulations, it's only going to get worse. So, I said it's impossible to truly define the warp, but there are rules that the warp has to follow. There are 3 rules that the warp must abide by. Firstly, the warp is defined by the material world. Secondly, it's empowered by mortal, sentient emotions. And lastly, souls that die all end up in the warp. Rule 1. The warp is a galactic ocean of pure antimatter that is also wholly defined and dependent on the material universe. In the simplest terms, the warp is exactly what people believe it is. If there was only one single sentient and psychically active being in the entire Milky Way galaxy, then they themselves would define what the warp is. Now, there's many other factors to this, and it's not that simple. But at the end of the day, it kind of is. One person won't have enough energy to have the warp feed on it to actually be able to manifest, yada yada yada. But essentially, that's how it works. If that one person believed that the warp was a dimension of pink fluffy unicorns that came to our world to deliver candy and presents to good little children, then the warp would be. If this person believed that the warp was a mirror image of our world, and every person was replaced by a demon in the shape of a bipedal giraffe, then it would be. Obviously, there are other factors that play into this. It's not this simple, but at the end of the day, it kind of is. Just on a much, much, much smaller scale. Now, obviously, this single person is still prey for the big four. Just because you don't know about them doesn't mean you're immune to the gods. You could never know who Nurgle is, but still want to get better every time you get sick. You still want the malady and the plague and the pains and the boils to go away. You could never hear of Khorne before, but if someone steals from you, or kicks you down the stairs, or pushes you down, or makes fun of you in front of your crush, you're still going to feel rage. These are core principles that humanity's built upon. You can't simply get rid of them. In the 40k universe, only a very few people know what the warp actually is. These are like the Navigators, the Guards, the Astartes, the Imperial Navy. The other billions and trillions of people that live in the 40k universe all worship the God Emperor. And in that religion, the God Emperor and his 9 sons battle against demons in the darkness. These people are given a choice. They can either live piously and die, so you may stand at the side of the God Emperor, or you can live sinfully and be sent to hell to be tortured by demons for all time. So when every single person in the galaxy believes that the warp is essentially the Abrahamic version of hell, with fire and brimstone and gibbering demons, then how could it not be? It was easy to see this manipulation during the 30th millennium, as the Emperor actively sought to erase religion from the universe. Again, not knowing about gods doesn't make you immune to them, but it makes it so much harder for those gods to do anything, if no one even knows your name. During the Horus Heresy, the Chaos Gods spoke and directly dialogued with Horus, and they told him that the Emperor was actively wiping out the Chaos Gods. Now, Chaos Gods are Chaos Gods because they cheat and they lie and they steal and they corrupt. So it's entirely possible that this was just simply a lie. But demons don't simply flat out lie in Warhammer, because the best lies always have a kernel of truth in them. So even if the gods weren't being wiped out by all of the actions of the Emperor, they would still be massively reduced. They have to be. The Emperor conquered millions of planets over 202 years. How many fledgling chaos cultists, how many Xenos species that worshipped the gods were wiped out? We saw an example of this with Fulgrim in the Horus Heresy, when he fought against the Lamian serpent cults, whatever they were. That was an entire race of people where their largest and their biggest and their greatest cities had massive, open, essentially flesh piles and pleasure palaces. Sure, they might not be worshipping Slanesh directly and sacrificing for them, but come on, dude. So when you wipe out millions of these, millions of planets, trillions of people, that has to have an effect. And it has to be one that was doing a real good job of getting rid of the gods. But I digress. With all of this being said, the warp is malleable, but there are some things that can't change. Rule 2. Emotional charge. Each of the 4 major chaos gods are nebulous collections and amalgamations of specific mortal extremities. Khorne is a war god, empowered by anger, bloodlust, and death. Nurgle is a plague god, empowered by despair and a desire to live. Tzeentch is a scheming god, empowered by a need for knowledge and the desire for power. Slanesh is a god of lust, empowered by sensory gratification and sensory excess. These 4 aren't people. They're not beings that were raised to godhood over time. They're literally the raw, unadulterated amalgamations of base human desires. As I stated earlier, it doesn't matter if you directly worship the gods. These 4 core principles are basically the building blocks of humanity. What is humanity except a species of people that look towards the future, that feel anger when we're cheated or beaten, and feel a desire and a need to live, a desire and a need to feel good and happy? Who are we if we're not these things? You can't remove them. Much like Newton's third law, every extreme human reaction will have an equal or opposite reaction in the warp. You can erase knowledge of them, bar them from ever reaching out from the warp, but you will always be there. Lastly, the warp is basically the afterlife. Except for a few very, very rare exceptions, every soul enters the warp after it dies. For the vast majority of people, this isn't honestly the absolute worst. The soul is pure energy, and the warp obviously absorbs energy. So the absolute vast majority of people are unremarkable, simple, unaware of any of the secrets of the universe. These are not people that the gods want or look for. Their souls are extinguished in an instant, consumed without any excitement or pleasure, simply for sustenance. People of great import, however, will take much, much longer to feed on, because their souls are so much more powerful and so much more important. Space Marines, for example, are wonderful playthings for the gods, because they can be tortured or corrupted over years or decades before all their energy is consumed. Space Marines live essentially forever unless they're killed. I mean, just look at Dante and Mephiston and the Blood Angels. He's been serving for thousands of years. Think of all the death he's wrought. Think of all the destruction, all the conquests he's championed. How would he not be an absolute feast for the Chaos Gods? Chaos Space Marines, or any Space Marines that have a patron god, will always be sent to that god after death. Which brings up an interesting topic with the Emperor and the Warp, but that's a whole different video. Chaos Space Marines fight so viciously and so savagely because they're terrified. Because they know if they fail, if they can't do what they promised to their god that they were going to do, they are going to be the new favorite bedtime toy of whatever chaos god they worship. Because that's the deal they make. Because if a champion succeeds in their task, they can become a champion of chaos. But much, much, much more than that. They want to be a demon prince. Because if you become a demon prince, then you are immortal. If you die, you will be sent to the warp, but you will live in the warp. You will not be consumed. Yes, you have immortality, and yes, you have more power than you ever had before. But the real important reason why they do that is because they don't want to die. They don't want to be tortured for decades after they die. The Word Bearers are an amazing example of this. They talk about it a lot in the Siege of Terra, where the Word Bearers, when they first found the Four, they were obviously very cautious, they were very wary, they didn't know what they were. But then once the Word Bearers finally understood what the Chaos Gods were, what they wanted and what they could do, the Word Bearers did not worship them because of love. They worshiped them out of fucking terror. Once you start worshiping chaos, the only way to escape your hellish afterlife is to receive a blessing. And you could do everything right, and you could still never get one. Because that is the deal of chaos. So, with these 3 rules in mind, let's return to our analogy of a chaotic ocean, because it's important to talk about what a warp storm is and what it can actually do. Imagine the ocean we talked about resting just below our world. Much like the Upside Down from Stranger Things, it's constantly just below the surface of our world, only very rarely sometimes bleeding over. The warp is described as a place of pure energy, but it can always gain more. Because much like a real ocean, the more energy it has, the more tumultuous the waves will become. Every extreme human emotion, reaction, or death can be thought of as a pebble dropping into the ocean. Sure, it'll create a ripple, it'll create a wave, but as a whole, it's entirely inconsequential to the ocean. However, if a raiding Chaos Space Marine warband comes to a planet and kills the entire population, that's 7 billion pebbles dropped into the ocean. That's capable of creating very big waves, and even creating warp storms. Warp storms are what happen when the waves reach so high that it starts to spill over the edges and into our reality. So in a universe where planet-wide exterminations are semi-frequent, the resulting waves are constant and gigantic. The term warp storm itself is really just an umbrella or a catch-all term for the almost infinite possibilities of what could happen when the warp bleeds into our reality. The blending of material and immaterial is always unpredictable, and it can't be relied upon or expected. Sometimes it's mild interference, blocking Vox or radio communications. Other times it can make warp travel dangerous, delaying ships for weeks or sending them far off course somewhere else. Other times, entire solar systems will be blanketed in chaos demons. An example I'd like to use to help kind of explain this happens on a cute little planet called Armageddon in 440 M41. It was a fairly strong warp storm, and it stopped travel to and from the planet. Now this in and of itself doesn't sound like that big of a deal. Armageddon is a hive planet, meaning it holds tens of billions of people in only a few massively, ridiculously large cities called hive cities. Hive cities are literal mountain ranges of buildings built on top of each other as massive processing and production facilities. Because of this, the billions and billions of people on the planet were entirely reliant upon food deliveries. Without these food deliveries, there was no way in hell Armageddon could feed its populace. There's no way in hell it could have stores to try to feed its populace for tens of billions of people. Most people live on the verge of starvation because of these conditions. So when food is 1 day late, that's a big deal. And when a warp storm comes, you don't know how long it's going to be there. It could be a couple hours, it could be years. So it's not surprising when pretty much the entire populace broke out into a riot. This, paired with the rise of both heretical cults and an increase in birth mutations because of, all of the warp, a ticking time bomb is not aggressive enough of a description to describe the state of this planet. So when a particularly blood-soaked Red Angel arrived with his favorite steroid connoisseurs, things got really messy. All of this is to say, warp rifts are tears in the material universe that allows not only warp energy, but also demons to slip into our world. Most of these rifts are formed by incredibly extreme acts of devotion or sacrifice, such as the planetary destruction talked about earlier. But these type of rifts are unstable, and they can only exist as long as they're being fed. On Armageddon, that Red Angel Angron created several warp rifts to pull bloodletters into our reality so he could dominate the planet. However, when the Grey Knights and the Space Wolves arrived and started beating back chaos and started destroying these altars, this energy was running up. That means all of the demons they'd summoned, some of them are simply starting to demanifest. Others of them are combat ineffective because they're so racked with pain and torture. Angron himself requires lots of warp energy to be somewhere. So he was having a really bad time with it before the Grey Knights started whooping him. This isn't to say, however, that there are no stable rifts, because there are some. The most obvious of them being the Eye of Terror. The Oculus Maledictum, as some other people call it, is a massive tear that constantly bleeds chaotic energy into our world. It's so large and so dangerous and so infested with Chaos Space Marines that Space Marine chapters were created just to watch over this place. Never before has that type of power been created for guard duty. You have 20,000 space marines basically standing around all day, just hanging out, waiting for something to happen. That is an incalculably large waste for the Imperium. Do you know what 20,000 space marines could do? Someone did the math. I remember I read about this a few years ago. They said that if the Ultramarines came to Earth, it would take 70 to 80 of them to take the planet. With the technology that we have now, with the nuclear weapons and everything else, it would take 70 to 80 of them to conquer the planet. And they have 20,000 just laying around, essentially. That should tell you just how dangerous and powerful the Eye of Terra is. However, I have kind of lied to you, because they're not just sitting around. The Astartes Praeses, the 20 legions, are under constant battles to remain pure. Because when you sit that close to hell for that amount of time, 10,000 years, since the end of the Horus Heresy and the end of the Scouring, anybody would be corrupted. Everybody would be corrupted. Of the 20, 2 of them have, and a third one was wiped out. So 17 of the original 20 still stand there, and none of them are in full strength, especially after the 13th Crusade. The warp puckered between the surface of reality before detonating into existence. It was an ugly, catastrophic eruption that vomited raw madness and broken shards of tainted impossibility. Opening into a festering wound on the face of space-time, the tear in actuality defied the pathetic rules of what was and what could be. Freakish things that could not live outside of nightmares became solid for brief moments. The sheer force of the breach, willing them into existence. Around the rippling, shrieking edges of the tear, great coruscating tides of lethal radiation and charm-tainted particle storms turned the airless void into a blaze of soul-twisting pseudo-colors. And from their becalmed prison in the depths of the Immaterium, the flotilla of the Death Guard Legion found their escape. The warp is something that exists and something that sits outside of our reality, but it's something that humanity has learned to tap into. Because as humanity evolved and it reached down to the stars, 2 distinct mutations occurred in the human genome. Psychers is a blanket term for all of the people that can draw upon the powers of the warp and make it manifest in the material universe. And navigators are humans that are capable of observing and navigating ships that are traveling through the warp. We'll start with navigators. Navigators are true mutants, being born with a third eye in the middle of their forehead. In the Imperium, mutants are reviled and killed often at birth, as they're seen as impure. But navigators are one of the very few exceptions. In the 18th millennium, navigators began to be born, but people aren't really sure why. There was surely a period of outrage, where they were just simply killed along with all of the other visible mutants, but eventually their true abilities were discovered. The navigator's third eye doesn't view our world. It views the Immaterium. In the early era of humanity, these navigators were able to do this unassisted. The immaterial ocean was so much calmer and so much more stable that navigators could, basically by themselves, navigate a ship through the warp. Yes, they always use choirs of multiple, and yes, you're always going to want to double-check your systems when you're moving in galactic distances, but if you needed to, it was possible. But after the birth of Slaanesh, this became impossible. So, in the modern day, the navigators aren't actually looking around inside the Immaterium, seeing where they are. All they're doing is looking for the Imperial Lighthouse, the Astronomicon. The Astronomicon is a golden light that's sent out into the warp by the Golden Throne, and the Emperor of Man that's sitting upon it. As he has sat on this throne for 10,000 years, it's a constant light that can be used to track where anybody is in the universe. Now, it might seem that traveling over astronomical distances, triangulating a position with only a single point, is a massively inaccurate system. And it entirely is. This, combined with the warp storms and the ebb and flow of chaos, means that intersystem travel is inconceivably difficult and a very, very particular art. Navigators are incalculably valuable to the Imperium, and they know it. Navigators are some of the most powerful families in the Imperium, with some of them having family houses in the Imperial Palace. But regardless, they are at the end of the day still mutants. So, while they're hated by most, they're also entirely necessary. Warp travel under the supervision of a navigator is hazardous at best. Warp travel requires a few things to enter the warp. Most notably is the warp drive. The warp drive tears a hole in the fabric of reality to slip through the chaotic waves that underlie our galaxy. This is a big word soup to simply say, the warp drive lets you tear a hole into hell. This isn't a hyperdrive from Star Wars or warp speed from Star Trek where you just go super fast. This is actually probably much closer to A Wrinkle in Time. If 3 ships enter the warp at the same time, with the same destination in mind, if they're traveling on stable, defined warp routes, it's possible for them to exit the warp at the same time and same place. If ships don't use stable warp lanes, however, this becomes much more hazardous. A great example of this danger is the Tiger Claws. The Tiger Claws were in Astartes' successor chapter of the Astral Claws. They warp jumped away from their home planet along a stable warp lane and re-entered our reality 300 years later. To them, it had only been a few weeks. They had left their planet, gone into the warp, and now had arrived. This is, again, one of the extreme examples. I've been using a lot of those in this episode. But I'm trying to prove a point that if you think you understand just how bad the warp can be, it can pretty much always get worse. Because these 3 same ships, traveling on the same warp lane, could travel back to the place where they had originally left from. And one of them could make it on time. One of them could make it a few weeks late. And the third one could arrive at the final destination before they'd even left the last one. Ships in the warp are at the mercies of the tides. So large formations or fleets that travel together experience similar eddies, which makes sure that their formation usually stays somewhat intact. But again, you're flying through hell. So the other piece of equipment that a ship needs to have is a Geller field. Geller fields are similar to void shields, but instead of transmuting solid matter or kinetic energy into the warp, the Geller field repels the warp and holds in the material universe. It's essentially a shell that covers a ship as it passes through the warp, so it doesn't constantly get invaded by demons and monsters and all this other stuff. Technically, you don't need a Geller field to travel through the warp. I mean, the orcs love not having a Geller field, they just see it as like a hobby to them. But for most sane people in the universe, you're gonna have to have one. It is important to note, before I continue on, that not all of the warp is chaotic. All of chaos is the warp, yes. But all of the warp is not chaos. This can pretty easily be seen through sentient beings that can bend or use the warp to their will. These people are again referred to as psychers. Yes, these people are channeling the warp, but they are not necessarily channeling chaos. Any psyker that doesn't understand this distinction rarely lasts very long. Psychers are a much more common mutation on the baseline human. Psychers, along with most of the terms in this discussion, is a catch-all for the plethora of types they can be. Psychers generally pull energy from the warp and then expel it into the material universe in any number of forms. Most psychers are either ignorant of their abilities or too weak to use it adequately, but all of them are still dangerous. A full exhaustive list is far too long to go into here, but I'll cover a few. Astropaths are psychers that can communicate with other astropaths over incredible distances, essentially messaging machines for each other. Messages from Terra can reach out across the Milky Way in a matter of weeks, rather than the months that it would take to send through material means. This isn't like an email, however, as they communicate through symbols and images and emotions to describe the message. Astropaths carried this massive manual full of exhaustive lists of all of these different images and symbols, so that they basically break down and translate what's being sent to them. Because of this, it's often done in groups of 2 or 3 if possible, so that a consensus can be found about the true meaning of a message. Telepaths are another large group of psychers, either being able to read human emotions as an empath, or read a person's inner monologue. Fel's Roast is an example of this. He was a librarian for the Night Lords before and during the Horus Heresy. He was expelled from his legion before the Dropsite Massacre, leading him to survive the cleansing and work with Malcador against his legion during the war. He was capable of entering people's minds, pulling apart their consciences, and discovering their deepest fears. There are many, many more disciplines, and every single discipline is infinite in the variety it can have. The other notable disciplines are biomancy, divination, and pyromancy. Again, there's infinite variation in how they can present themselves, but at the end of the day, it's all simply branches of the same tree. Now, there is a third form of mutant, but even compared to the Navigators and the Psychers, they are massively rare. These are the pariahs. Pariahs, or blanks, are sentient beings that are born without a soul. The soul is what ties people to the warp, and what makes them capable of being affected by it. When someone is born without a soul, then they're a moving black hole for the warp. Their mere presence injures and damages beings of the warp, acting as an anathema to their being. Even mortal beings with a soul are uncomfortable in their presence, often described as beacons of fear or disgust from normal people. Blanks are valuable beyond measure. One of them is born in every 100 billion, and even these incredibly low numbers rarely survive, as who wants to have a child that disgusts you to touch it? Who wants to have a friend that makes you uncomfortable or feel like scratching your eyes out if they get close to you? These people rarely survive. Despite how long this YouTube video may say it has lasted, I have not had nearly enough time to talk about everything that can happen in the warp, or everything that happens with the warp. Now that we find ourselves at the end of the video, I'd like to make an apology for all of you sitting in here. I understand that having a video talking about something that can't be quantified or qualified in most possible ways is difficult to listen to and follow about. I gave many examples, very extreme examples, to try to show you the ranges of the things that could happen, but I understand it's probably still overwhelming and difficult to grasp in actual practice, as opposed to just in theory. So, my next video will be discussing the Chaos Gods themselves, both those that are canon and aren't anymore, talking about how they can interact with the warp themselves, the domains that they have within them, and the things that they want. Thank you for being here. It means a lot for you to be here on this starting of the voyage, and I hope that I'll get to see you again. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.